Today is the day that marks 5 years. 5 years of my life trapped in this prison. 5 years of counting every second, and 5 more to go. But it didn't begin here. It all began when I was 12 years old. I had been an altar boy for 2 years, and I loved helping at the church. The church was a big, beautiful place, with colorful windows that let sunlight shine through like magic. Every Sunday, I felt proud to stand at the altar and do my part to make the service special. That Sunday morning was no different. The other altar boys and I had finished preparing the altar for Massachusetts. The candles were flickering, the air smelled like incense, and everything was ready. But Father Matthew wasn't in the church yet. I decided to check on him. I walked to the parish house where he stayed. The hallway was quiet, with only the sound of my footsteps echoing. When I reached his door, I knocked softly. "Father Matthew, it's almost time for Mass," I called. After a pause, I heard his voice, soft and a little sleepy. "Come in, Chitty. The door is open." I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dim, with heavy curtains covering the windows. Father Matthew was sitting on his bed, his eyes half closed. "Close the door," he said, his voice calm but firm. I hesitated for a moment but did as he said. Then he patted the edge of his bed. "Come and sit here," he told me. I felt unsure, but I obeyed. Father Matthew was like a mini-god to me. His words were not to be questioned. When I sat down, he told me to touch him below the belt. I obeyed. Everything felt wrong, but I didn't know what to say. I did what he asked because I was too scared to do anything else. He took advantage of me. Father Matthew was someone everyone admired. His voice was strong but gentle, like a storyteller you couldn't stop listening to. He would sing during Mass, and the whole church would go quiet, his voice filling the room like a warm hug. People said he was full of God's blessings. That day, after Mass, he was his usual self. He smiled and played with the children, his voice full of kindness. People gathered around him, asking for prayers and blessings. Watching him, I felt like I was living in 2 different worlds. One world was the happy church, where everyone adored him. The other was the quiet, scary room where I had been earlier. When it was time to leave, I packed my things quickly. I wanted to go home, but Father Matthew stopped me. "Chitty, stay tonight," he said, his smile warm and kind. I didn't want to stay, but I nodded. I didn't know how to say no. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The parish house was dark and silent, except for the sound of the other altar boys breathing softly in their sleep. Then, I heard a soft knock on my door. My heart started to race. I didn't want to answer, but my legs felt like they were moving on their own. When I opened the door, there he was, his face calm and serious. "Come with me, Chitty," he said. I followed him down the hallway, my footsteps feeling heavier with each step. His room was the same as before, dim and quiet. He closed the door behind us, and I stood there, frozen. That night, it happened again. He took advantage of me, and the next weekend, and the weekend after that. It became something I dreaded every Friday when I returned to the parish house. One Wednesday evening, the sun was just beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. I had just returned from school, my bag feeling heavier than usual, and I couldn't wait to change out of my uniform. As I pulled off my socks, I heard my mom's voice from the living room. She sounded excited, almost like she was laughing. Curious, I peeped out of my room, still holding my school shirt. There, standing in the middle of our small living room, was Father Matthew. He wasn't just any priest to my family, he was like a part of us. My parents, being very devoted to the church, treated him like a special guest every time he visited. And tonight was no different. "Father Matthew," my dad exclaimed, shaking his hand like they were old friends. My mom immediately dashed into the kitchen, calling out, "Let me make something nice for you, Father." Before I knew it, the smell of pounded yam and sala soup filled the air. My stomach growled, but I stayed quiet as my mom set the table, placing everything in front of Father Matthew with a proud smile. He blessed the food with his usual calm voice, and we all sat around him in the living room as he began to talk. Father Matthew's voice had a way of pulling everyone in. He talked about God, shared stories from the Bible, and gave advice to my 3 older sisters. He told them to focus on their studies and always pray. Faith, my oldest sister, who was 16, listened intently, nodding at everything he said. I watched as he smiled at her, a smile that lingered just a little longer than usual. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Father Matthew was always smiling. Everyone loved him. When it was time for him to leave, he stood up and stretched. "Thank you for the meal, Mama Chitty. You always know how to make the best nsala soup," he said warmly. My mum beamed with pride, waving off the compliment. But just as he was about to step out, he turned back and said, "Mama Chitty, I could use a little help at the parish house. Faith could come with me to help clean and organize some things." My mum didn't hesitate. "Of course, Father. Faith, go with him and help him. Don't keep him waiting." Faith stood up quickly, grabbing a small bag. "Okay, Mama," she said, smiling. She followed Father Matthew out of the house, and I watched as they disappeared into the night. The evening passed quietly. I finished my homework and got ready for bed. But just as I was about to sleep, the phone rang. My dad answered, his voice low as he listened. Then he called out to my mum, "It's Father Matthew. He says Faith will stay over tonight because she hasn't finished helping him." My mum nodded, unconcerned. "That's fine. She'll be back tomorrow." I felt a little uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. Faith was responsible, but she had never stayed out overnight without telling me first. I tried to shake off the feeling and went to sleep. The next morning, I woke up early, expecting to see Faith back at home, but she wasn't there. My mum didn't seem worried, saying, "Maybe she's still finishing up at the parish house." Hours passed, and the uneasiness in my chest grew. Something didn't feel right, but no one else seemed to notice. My parents trusted Father Matthew completely. After all, he was like family. When Faith finally came home later that day, she was quiet. She didn't say much, even when my mum asked her about her time at the parish house. She just smiled faintly and went straight to her room. I didn't want to keep going to the parish house every weekend, but my parents wouldn't listen. My mother thought I was trying to stay home just to roam the streets and play all day. Even when I begged to stay, she wouldn't allow it. Every Friday evening, I had to pack my bag and head back to the parish house, even though I dreaded what would happen there. Every weekend was another episode with Father Martins. Sometimes, he would even come to our house during the week and take my younger sister back to the parish house with him. I didn't understand why he always wanted to be around us, but my parents never questioned it. They trusted him completely. As time went on, my feelings started to change. At first, I felt scared and confused, but eventually, I started to accept it, even finding moments where I thought I enjoyed the attention. It was strange, and I didn't know how to make sense of it. One weekend, 2 of Father Martin's friends came to visit him. They were both Reverend Fathers too, dressed in their long robes and carrying an air of authority. That evening, Father Martins told me and 2 other altar boys that we were going somewhere special with his friends. I didn't dare question him. We drove to a hotel, the kind with big, shiny doors and lights that made the night feel alive. Inside a large room, Father Martins and friends sat us down. They laughed and talked like nothing was unusual. But that night was different, more terrifying than anything I'd ever experienced. The 3 priests took turns with each of us. It felt like the room grew darker and colder with every moment. I wanted to cry, to run, to disappear, but I couldn't. It was like my voice and my body didn't belong to me anymore. It wasn't until that night that I realized the other altar boys were going through the same things I was. None of us had ever spoken about it. We each carried the weight of our secret, believing we were alone. But in that moment, I saw the fear and pain in their eyes, and I knew we were all trapped in the same nightmare. One quiet afternoon, my sister Faith wasn't feeling well. She had been lying on the couch for hours, her face pale, her body weak. My mother thought it was malaria, so she gave her some drugs and told her to rest. "You'll feel better soon," she said. But Faith didn't. Days passed and Faith got worse. She barely ate, couldn't sleep, and looked sicker every day. My father finally decided to take her to the hospital. We were all worried. I sat by the window that day, waiting for them to return. When they finally did, my father's face was serious, like something heavy was weighing on him. Inside the house, my mother rushed to Faith. "What did the doctor say? Is it malaria?" My father hesitated, looking at Faith, who stared at the floor. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "Faith is pregnant." The words felt like a bomb exploding in the room. My mother's eyes widened in shock. "Pregnant?" she repeated, as if she hadn't heard him right. Then she screamed and fell to the ground, holding her head. "My enemies have succeeded," she wailed, tears streaming down her face. "They've ruined my life. Faith, you've brought shame to this family. What will people say? Oh, God, I am finished." Faith just stood there, silent and trembling. My parents began shouting at her. "Who is responsible?" My father demanded. "Who did this to you?" Faith didn't say a word. She just kept looking at the floor, her tears falling silently. The whole day passed like that. Questions, anger, and silence. The next morning, my mother had enough. She grabbed a cane and stormed into Faith's room. "If you won't talk, I'll make you talk," she shouted. Faith cried and begged her to stop, but my mother was relentless. The sound of the cane hitting Faith's back echoed through the house. My heart pounded as I watched from the corner, too scared to say anything. Then, suddenly, Faith screamed, "It's Father Martins." Everything stopped. My mother froze, the cane still in her hand. My father, who had been standing silently, looked at Faith with disbelief. "What did you say?" my mother whispered. "It's Father Martins," Faith repeated, sobbing. "He's the one." The room went quiet, so quiet that I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. My mother dropped the cane, her hands shaking. "You're lying," she said finally. "You're trying to cover up your shame. A man of God would never do such a thing." My father nodded. "Faith, stop lying. This is your mistake, and you need to own up to it." But Faith insisted. She cried and begged them to believe her, but they refused. To them, she was just a wayward girl who had brought disgrace to the family. My mother kept calling her names: useless, disgraceful, ruined. The following week, my parents made a decision. They said the shame was too much to bear. They couldn't let anyone find out. "We have to end this," my father said. That was how they took Faith to the hospital to have an abortion. She cried the entire time, begging them to stop, but they didn't listen. When it was over, they came home and acted like it never happened. They never confronted Father Martins. They never even mentioned his name again. But Faith was never the same after that. She became quiet, like a shadow of herself. She barely spoke to anyone, not even me. She used to be the brightest in her class, always coming first, but now she was at the bottom. Her teachers complained, but my parents didn't care. My mother started treating her even worse. She would yell at Faith for the smallest things, calling her horrible names. "You're nothing but a shame to this family," she'd say. Faith just took it, her face blank, as if she had no fight left in her. Watching all this made me feel even more trapped. I wanted to speak up about what Father Martins had been doing to me, but I was too scared. If my parents didn't believe Faith, why would they believe me? And after seeing how they treated her, I didn't want to face the same thing. But a part of me also didn't want to stop. By then, I had started to enjoy the attention. Sometimes I even looked forward to going to the parish house. It made me feel special in a strange, confusing way. I didn't understand what was happening to me, but I knew one thing. I couldn't tell anyone. Not my parents, not Faith, not anyone. There was a woman named Mama Rose. She was like a star in the church, always helping, always smiling. She was married with 4 kids, and everyone admired her for her dedication to God. Every weekend, she brought her delicious meals to Father Martins. He would smile and thank her, and she would always say, "It's my pleasure, Father." But as time went on, I started noticing things. She wasn't just dropping off food. Sometimes she would stay, and not just for a little while. She would enter Father Martin's room and stay there for hours, sometimes until late at night. First, I didn't think much of it. Maybe they were praying together, I thought. Or maybe she was sharing her troubles with him. But something didn't sit right with me. Why didn't she leave like everyone else? Why did she always wait until no one was watching before she entered his room? One night, my curiosity got the best of me. I decided to find out what was going on. The house was quiet. Mama Rose had arrived earlier with her usual trays of food. I watched as she went straight to Father Martin's room. The door closed softly behind her. My heart was pounding as I crept down the hallway. I didn't know what I was going to find, but I couldn't stop myself. I reached the door and pressed my ear against it. At first, I didn't hear anything, just silence. I was about to walk away when I heard it. A soft moan. Then another. My stomach turned. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I stayed frozen by the door, my heart racing. The sounds grew louder, more unmistakable. They were having sex. Couldn't breathe. How could this be happening? Mama Rose, the holy woman everyone admired, and Father Martins, the man of God who preached about righteousness every Sunday. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to do. As I lay in bed that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Anger and sadness filled me, but there was something else. Jealousy. And then came the memories. My sister Faith. It had been 3 years since her abortion. She hadn't been the same since. She used to be so full of life, always laughing and joking. Now, she was like a ghost, moving through the house silently, her eyes always downcast. I hated seeing my sister like that, and I hated myself for staying silent. Now I was 16, and the weight of everything was crushing me. I felt like I was drowning in secrets. Father Martins had hurt Faith, and he had hurt me too. And now I had discovered his affair with Mama Rose. How many others were there? How many lives had he ruined while pretending to be a man of God? I knew I couldn't stay silent forever. But how could I expose someone so powerful? Someone everyone trusted. The thought of speaking up terrified me. I had seen what happened to Faith when she tried to tell the truth. No one believed her. They blamed her instead. What if the same thing happened to me? But deep down, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't let Father Martins continue to hurt people. I couldn't let him destroy more lives. That night, I made a promise to myself. I would find a way to bring him down, no matter how hard it was. The journey ahead was uncertain, but I was determined. For my sister, for myself, and for everyone else who had suffered in silence. It was time for the truth to come out, and this time I wouldn't back down. I even considered going to the church to confess everything to the congregation. But how could I do that? What would I say? The thoughts swirled in my mind like a storm, keeping me awake all night. The worst part of it all was that he still slept with me. Sometimes I felt like I enjoyed it, but at the same time, I hated him for what he was doing to me and for making my sister feel so lost and useless. Felt like everything was falling apart around me. One night, while I was at the parish house, something strange happened. I was walking by Father Martin's room when I heard voices coming from inside. My curiosity got the better of me, so I stopped to listen. I didn't want to eavesdrop, but I couldn't help myself. What if something important was happening? Inside the room, a girl was talking to Father Martins. She sounded really upset as she said, "I can't have an abortion, sir. I'm a Christian. I can't kill a human being, especially not my own baby. Our baby." Father Martin's voice boomed back at her. "It's not a baby, Jane, it's just blood. Just take this pill and flush it out. As for God, you can ask for forgiveness later. Don't worry. I'll even pray for you because God listens to me quickly. That solves everything." I felt my heart race as I listened to their conversation. How could he say such things? It didn't seem right at all. They kept talking until Jane finally agreed to take the pill. Then I heard them start kissing. My stomach dropped. Shocked and scared, I quickly ran down the stairs and sat outside by the car, trying to process what I had just heard. I waited for Jane to come out. When she finally left the compound, I followed her from a distance. She walked slowly down the road, looking lost in her thoughts. Jane was about 17 years old. She was one of the choir members and seemed so dedicated, confident and strong at church. But now she looked vulnerable and afraid. I followed her until she turned onto a quiet road where there were no people around. Taking a deep breath, I decided it was time to confront her. "Jane," I called out as I stepped forward to block her path. She looked startled and then worried when she saw me. "What do you want?" she asked. "I heard everything you talked about with Father Martin," I said softly. Her eyes widened in fear as she pleaded with me. "Please, Chitty, don't tell anyone. If my parents find out, they will kill me." "Calm down," I said quickly to reassure her. "I won't tell anyone what you said or what happened." She looked relieved but still anxious. "Really? You promise?" "Yes," I replied firmly. "But there's one condition. Don't take that pill he gave you today." Jane nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. "But what am I supposed to do? I feel so lost." "We can figure this out together," I said gently. "Let's meet tomorrow near the village square after church. We can talk more then." "Okay," she agreed quietly, wiping away her tears with the back of her hand. "I have to go back to the parish house before they notice I'm gone," I said quickly. As we parted ways, my mind raced with thoughts about what had just happened. The next day, I arrived at the village square, feeling anxious and hopeful. I waited for Jane, glancing at the path she would come from, but time passed and she didn't show up. I stood there for an hour, my heart sinking with every minute. Just as I was about to leave, I finally spotted her coming down the road. Relief washed over me as I waved to her. "Jane," I called out, rushing to meet her. "Sorry I'm late," she said, looking a bit flustered. "I had to be careful." We walked together toward a nearby bush where we could talk privately. Once we were hidden from view, I took a deep breath and began to explain my own struggles. I told her about my sister and how Father Martin had been sleeping with both of us. As I spoke, I could see the shock on her face. Jane's eyes filled with tears as she listened. "I can't believe it," she whispered. He raped me the first day we were alone together. Since then, he's been sleeping with me too." Her voice trembled as she spoke, and I felt a wave of sadness wash over me. I wanted to comfort her, but also needed to convince her not to go through with an abortion. "Jane," I said gently, "if you keep this baby, it will be evidence against Father Martin. We can expose him for what he's done." Her expression turned fearful. "But what if no one believes us, Chitty? Father Martin is loved by everyone in the community. He helps the widows, prays for the sick, and somehow they get better. He pays for many children's school fees and feeds the hungry. We can't fight him." I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of her words. She was right. Father Martin had built a reputation that made him untouchable in many people's eyes. But deep down, I knew we had to try. "I understand it will be hard," I finally replied. "But your pregnancy is proof of what he has done. Some people will believe us, and if we expose him, maybe others who have suffered will come forward too." Jane looked down at the ground, tears streaming down her cheeks as she thought about what I had said. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. "What will happen if my parents find out? What will the community say?" "We can figure that out together," I reassured her. "You're not alone in this. I'm here with you." After a long silence filled with uncertainty and fear, Jane finally nodded slowly. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's do it." We decided that our first step would be to go to the King's Place next week to report what Father Martin had done before taking any further action. 2 days later, I was sitting in the living room when my mom came home, her eyes red and puffy from crying. I could feel my heart sink as I saw the sorrow on her face. Something terrible had happened. We rushed to her, asking what was wrong. With a shaky voice, she began, "Children of nowadays will be the end of their parents. Jane has brought shame to her family." "Which Jane?" I asked, my stomach twisting in knots. "The choir mistress?" "Yes," my mom replied, tears streaming down her cheeks. "They said she got pregnant by an unknown person. Last night, she took a drug to terminate it. She locked herself in her room, and by the time her parents found her, it was too late. She is dead." My heart felt like it had stopped. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Jane was gone. I didn't even think. I just ran out of the house as fast as I could, my mind racing with shock and disbelief. I had to get to Jane's house. When I arrived at her compound, it felt like the whole world had come to a standstill. People were gathered outside, crying and mourning. The air was thick with sadness, and I could feel my heart breaking as I saw the grief on everyone's faces. I pushed through the crowd and hurried into their sitting room. There she was, Jane lying lifelessly on the floor. My heart shattered into a million pieces at the sight of her still body. I couldn't hold back my tears any longer. I cried out loud, wailing in despair. It felt like all the pain and anger inside me exploded at once. Why did this happen? I shouted into the silence of the room, my voice filled with rage and sorrow. Why didn't anyone help her? I felt so helpless standing there, surrounded by people who loved her but couldn't save her. The reality of what had happened hit me like a heavy stone in my chest. Jane was gone forever, and there was nothing I could do to bring her back. Overwhelmed with grief and anger, I left her house and ran towards the parish house. I had reached my breaking point. The weight of everything had become too much to carry, and I knew it had to end today. This was the moment where it all came to a head, where the truth would be laid bare. This was the final stand. No more running, no more silence. It was time for one of us to win.